Welcome to the first part of the course Responsive Web Applications with Bootstrap and CSS. This is the introduction to CSS part. My name is Farhad Eftekari and I'm the lecturer of this course. Make sure that you already been registered in the portal to have access to the material of the portal. If not, then you can easily also register with this link. Here are some typographical conventions that we're going to use throughout the course. You'll see them on the bottom of the slides, so make sure to be familiar with them. And here are difficulty level indicators. You may see them on the top of the slides. Some materials has been divided into easy materials, some moderate, and well, for the students who want to gain deeper knowledge in the topics, the material has been divided also into hard material. Here is the slide framework. You may see the title here, difficulty level indicator here, slide number, the content, the course name, section name, and those conventions that we discussed. For the content of this part, we will mainly be familiar with CSS concept and how to use it, different elements, properties, how to select a specific element. So it's a very nice introduction and require knowledge in order for us to be able to actually work with Bootstrap. So first we're going to understand CSS, well, the relation between HTML and CSS, how CSS works, how we can insert CSS files, how to work with CSS selectors in order to select the elements, if there are some overlapping rules, inheritance, and then the colors, different ways of using colors, how to style text, and how to work with fonts and typefaces, and how to style links. Then the concept of hover, active, focus for the links. What is boxes and how to use these different kind of elements, and how to style lists, tables, forms, and then the layouts, and also how to work with images, and then finally HTML5 layout elements. Alright, now let's familiar with the definition of HTML, as most of you may know already. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. You may get this joke at the end of this part. And to understand CSS, actually, when you're having HTML elements, you are creating the fundamental of your pages. All those elements are being placed on your web page, but CSS job is to tell the browser how you actually render those elements inside of your browser. So there are like some specific rules, CSS rules that they are being applied on elements based on the look of them, like how big are they, like what's like the position of each elements, and all of this is stuff related to the rendering of those elements on your screen and your browser. Here there is this box model in CSS, so every element can have width and height, and then they're padding around it, the space between the element and the border of that, and then after border also there could be margins to also have some sort of a space next to the other elements. So there is this box model for CSS that you can see here. It's really nice to understand this definition, because later on when you want to place your CSS elements, it could be very handy to get familiar with this concept, and then later be able to define the padding, border, margin, and the size of your element based on this model. So the reason that CSS has been created, first of all, because HTML was never intended to contain text for like formatting your web page. So the whole purpose of HTML, as I said before, was these elements to be inserted inside of a web page. So it's some sort of a forbidden approach for web designers to tell the HTML element how to look like when they are like being defined. So it's always nicer and always like recommended to use CSS rules in order to tell the browser how to render them. And here, as you can see in the example, well, the content of the page is being placed in HTML, but all the criteria about the design should be included in the CSS. Actually, nowadays, when you are placing this CSS stuff inside of your like web page, instead of like using CSS rules, if your editor is some sort of a smart editor, it will give you some hints that, well, this is not a nice thing to do. You shouldn't include these rules next to your HTML page. And also, there are some HTML tags that can define the look and the design of the page. As an example, this font tag. So it's created some sort of a vague and confusion for developers and designers, because by creating these tags, you're somehow mixing the job of HTML and CSS, and it's not a very nice thing to do. So that's why it's considered as a nightmare, and it's not recommended to use those tags such as font, because it's always nicer to put the content between like a span HTML tag, and then by applying CSS rules, you tell what would be the font and the size of that text inside of that span HTML tag. Later we will see an example. And the suggestion, well, obviously was like creating CSS, and then we separate the purpose and the job of these two languages apart from each other. And then in short, then CSS remove the style formatting from the HTML page, which also makes it much easier to read an HTML page and also develop and extend it. So then we consider HTML and CSS best friend forever, because you need to use them together in order to create a page to be actually nice enough for a visitor to actually see and browse it. And let's also stress out about the different layers and different purpose of HTML, CSS. So HTML, we use it as a structural layer. You see, we have the head here, we have the body, we have the foot, and then for CSS, it's a presentation layer to actually tell the browser how to render and how to show these different kind of elements. When you want to write your CSS or HTML code, you need an editor in order to do that. Of course, you may use also Notepad, but it's not very recommended, because by using editors, you're gonna create your web pages and your like files much faster, much easier. There are like auto suggestions. It can help you, or like shortcuts. All of these nice features that are there for you to use in order to like also explore or find some part of your page, or put them inside of a tree view for your tags and everything. So it's much nicer that you somehow try to search and find a very nice editor that you feel comfortable with, but using it. Later we're gonna actually recommend some of very nice free ones for you as well. So it's always recommended to use a very nice editor. So usually they have two parts. The first part is the code view, and the second part would be the visual editor. Of course, you can also open the files inside of a browser and then see how the pages are really look like there. And here are the most important, most recommended free editors that you can also use. I'm going to use Atom inside of this course because it's also very easy and nice to use, but all of them are very nice and like easy to use. And of course, as I said, they're all free for you to use. And as I said before, you can also use Notepad because the important part is these tags being saved with the properties, elements, and everything, and then in the browser you'll be able to open them and see the page. And then if you're like in a hurry, you can also use online editors by searching like HTML online editor. Then you can also see tons of them online and be able to use them. And if you never installed any of them, here I provided some content for you in order to get some tips about installing Atom text editor. You can download it from this link, and they have like very nice features. You can also make yourself familiar with them. And not only you may use them for writing your HTML and CSS code, and you can also use many of those editors in order to write in like different kind of programming languages as well. Here are the lists of like the main ones, and of course by using add-ons, then we can probably add more languages as well. This is like the instruction for installing Atom. If you haven't installed any of them, I recommend you right now actually do that. And then there's the concept of packages. So when you install packages, you somehow give them more functionality if you need, like I said, another language to write or some other features. There's a very nice open source community for that as well. And here is also a video that you can use in order to set up your browser. Set up your editor. We're not going to go through that because, well, the material are there for you to use, and I'm not going to make everyone bored with those parts which are not really directly related to the course. But here is a very nice material for that. And then here is an example of a screenshot of a Atom text editor. As you can see here, there's a very nice tree view of the files, folders, and you can easily select them and then have them as a tab view in order to select the files that you already opened. And then this color coding is also very, very interesting. It makes it much easier for you to write your code. Alright, now let's get familiar how CSS actually works. Later we will get more familiar with the selector, but when you're writing your CSS code, you need to use a selector in order to select a specific or a range and group of elements. So here you can see as a H1, which is heading number 1, we are selecting it, and then we are somehow declaring some properties, CSS properties, to that a specific element or a specific group of elements. So now here, all of these H1 tags, which may be available in the web page, the color of them will turn to red. So this is how we define a CSS rule. Very easy. So the property has to be like this, and then double dot, and then the value of that property. We don't need to place it inside of a quotation or double quotation or anything. And here, if you want to apply more than one rule, then we can use semicolon and then the other line, the other property, and the other value of that certain property. Very nice and easy to use. Here I created a sample for your actually HTML file and also your CSS file. Let's save them in a editor. So we need to create actually 2 pages, one for HTML and then the other one for CSS file. I'm going to copy paste this content inside of my HTML file. Make sure these double quotations are double quotations, because sometimes when you convert them from Microsoft Office, copy paste them there from there and then to your HTML file, there are like different characters, so they may mess up the whole page for you. I'm gonna save my HTML file here, and then I'm gonna save my style file here as well. So let's very quickly go through this HTML file. We have this declaration of HTML5, as you may know. Then we have the HTML tag, head tag for the title, and then we are placing the CSS file as an external CSS file, which later we can get familiar how we can insert our CSS file inside of a web page. We'll see. So this is one of the ways actually. And then we're closing our head tag and then start the body tag. And then we have H1, the heading, and then some content inside of this paragraph tag, and then H2 heading, and then the other paragraph, and then we are closing body and HTML tag. And also here for the CSS file, you may see we are defining the font family of the content inside of the body tag. So the first font would be Arial, and then second would be Verdana. So for any reasons, if the machine doesn't have Arial font, it may use the Verdana font. And then we are defining this color, which I assume it's red, to H1 and H2. And then this color, which is some shades of gray, to the content of paragraph tag. So now that we saved it, let me just open the HTML file. This is the file that actually exactly as the example here as well. So that's it. We created our very first HTML and CSS files and reviewed them. Now let's get familiar how we can insert the CSS files. We can use external style sheet, we can use inline style, and we can use internal style sheet. So this is the first method that we already used. So we have like all of the CSS rules and styles inside of an external file, and we are pointing to that file inside of our head file. Why in head file? Because head file is the first part that is being rendered inside of a browser. So by doing that, we make sure first this file is being loaded, and then the other content of the web page is being rendered inside of a browser page. So you need to follow the exact format of this example here, and then your file name is also important. And where probably you need to clean up and then put the style files inside of a certain folder like styles or CSS. So make sure to properly point out to the file. Here we have the link element. Then we are defining the path, the type, and then the relationship between HTML page and the file. And here also we have an example of internal style sheet. So instead of placing these parts inside of external file, we are placing them inside of HTML file, but then we need to also add this style tag here and then close it as well. It can work, but is always recommended for you to separate your HTML page and styles. But of course you can do it. You may also save it and then see the result is exactly the same as we actually opened that example inside of the browser. And then the worst way of like doing it is to actually use internal style. So whenever you are defining an element, then you're also mentioning the style. It's a horrible approach. Why? Because when you are having your CSS styles in another file, it's much easier to modify them, and it's much easier to use some sort of a universal style for all of your web pages and website. So by modifying one file, you are affecting and having this impact of like changes on all the pages, instead of like going and finding every single element and applying and modifying those rules. So you're gonna save a lot of time and energy, and then you can also focus on more important areas. So please never do that, but it's nice to know that you can, but do not try. And of course you can also save it and then see exactly it works like the other ones. So the question is, if you are applying multiple rules on different ways of like external, internal, how are they being applied? And the answer would be based on this order. So the least order would be the browser default, because they also have some sort of a default rules, and then external, internal style sheets, and then inline style. Because first these rules are being loaded, and then these guys are like somehow rewriting those rules. Now let's compare internal, external styles. Well, the internal is suitable for single page websites because they're like single page, and maybe it could be nicer to have them like in one page, but only because they are like single page. But still I recommend you to separate them, but that can work, because then that the reason that we defined and discussed that if you have multiple pages and you have multiple elements, then it's much easier to actually modify one CSS file. But then in those scenarios which you have only one single page, then maybe that reason is not really important. And maybe if certain page requires certain CSS rules. I'm still not very happy about this one. And then for external, it's also, as we said, it's easier for developers and faster loading time. Why? Because this file as an external file is being cached in your browser. So whenever you are going to other pages, that file has been already loaded. So it's a very good actually point to make your pages much faster to load inside of a browser, and also let the users also not waste their bandwidth or something. Well, of course, it's not a problem in Finland, but maybe some other places the internet speed is not as fast as here, or the bandwidths are limited. One subject which is really important in CSS is how to select a CSS element in order to apply some rules for that. Well, HTML element, not CSS. In order to apply those CSS rules. So it's very important that you be able to properly select a CSS element inside of a page. So first you need to select it and then apply the CSS rules. As you can see here, there are many ways of selecting. You can select a specific element or a class or a specific ID. I expect you to actually be familiar with classes, IDs, and this kind of stuff, which is also HTML related material. Here, it is a universal selector. It means everything, so all the elements. I don't recall that I ever used it, but it's nice to know that you can actually do it. Or you can select a type or a specific element selector, for instance h1, and then applying some rules. So it means all these h1 elements, these CSS rules are being applied to them. And then class selector, so you can easily define a class to a specific elements and then select them by using the class name and then apply those CSS rules. Or ID selector, which you can assign an ID inside of this HTML page to a special element and then select it in CSS and apply those rules. So make sure that you get these characters here, dot the class name and then hashtag the ID name. It's very important. Don't use them interchangeably. So this is the ID and this is the class. And of course, when you are defining a class, you don't need to mention this dot, or when you are defining ID, you're not mentioning the hash character. It's just this name that is being used. That's it. And here you can select a child. And then here, if there is any order, so it means if there is a tag inside of a P element. And the ones that are next to each other. I don't ever recall also I used these guys, but it's nice to know that you can use them. And there are also tons of examples online, but in a very rare scenarios you have to use them. But it's nice to know that the ability exists and you can get the best out of them. Now let's see the difference between ID and class. IDs are unique, so you are specifically assigned an ID to a specific element. But classes are not unique, and you're like defining a class for wider range of elements. Of course, you can only assign a class to one element, but in those cases, make sure to use ID because that's the reason for difference between them as well. And here is also the way we write them. Let me just actually modify this here. As I told you before, Office sometimes change them, so when you copy paste them, then there are some mistakes along the way, but now it's fine. So here you see the ID attribute, the value. As I told you before, the hashtag doesn't exist here. It only exists inside of the CSS ruling selector. And then class and the value here. Of course, you can have for certain element both ID and class. And here is a fun comparison between class, ID, and div. You can also insert many elements inside of a div element, and then by applying rules to this div element, you're applying to all of those elements inside of a div HTML tag. And for overlapping, the last rule is the one is being applied. Not the first one, not the second one, the last one actually. In order of how the browser is loading and rendering your web page. And here you can also see the inheritance. Now let's get familiar with the concept of colors. There are three ways you can define colors to your elements: by using RGB code, or the hex code, or the color name. Very easy, very nice to use. We're going to get familiar with actually all these different styles. And here are the color related properties. We have color, background color, opacity, and border color. They are self-explanatory. And here those 16 basic color names, which you can also use. Makes your code also much easier to read. And here, this RGB color coding, the first one is red, the second one green, and the third one is blue. So you're somehow defining between 0 to 255. So the greater the number is, that color is like being inserted a bit stronger. Here also you can see example how you define a value for the property. And here also the hex code declaration. The first one is red, second one is green, the third one is blue. So here you mean this hex color, as you can see here. Somehow definitely you can predict it's like totally red, because the value for green and blue are 0, so no green or no blue color is being inserted, but the red one is like the biggest one. FF in hex code exactly is equal to 255. There are also online converters where you can use. And here are also some like well-known or most frequently used hex colors. So here you can see from, it's a very interesting point here, from white to black, you see the shades of gray is being created. So whenever you are like placing exact same amount of red, blue, and green, then you are being defined from white to black. The less you insert the colors, the more black they're gonna get. The more you insert them, the more white they're gonna get. And here also, you can also select different colors from different tools, and the combination of two colors. I think that was like something that you probably studied in your elementary school, so it's a very interesting primitive topic. And here you see by using the color coding in 3 different styles, you can also define the colors. And of course, whenever you feel like using one style, you can also use it. It doesn't mean that each CSS file needs to use certain and exact style. Of course, it's recommended to use it on your own with the same style. This is not a good practice, actually. And then the concept of opacity actually is also very interesting. So as you can see here in this example, the color is being faded away from totally white to not so white. So the opacity 1 is the biggest, and then 0 is like the lowest here, as you can see. Then of course you can also see the back color of that element as well. It's also interesting, and sometimes very handy tool. Sometimes when you're like applying mouse over rules, then whenever like a user like mouse over your element, then you put them into more focus. So it's also one of these features that you can probably use for that purpose as well. And then the border color, you can also see here there are different styles. Solid is this one, dash, dot, double, and then the other ones. You can see how you can actually define the border colors here as well. Also tons of material online if you want to gain more knowledge. You can also try by yourself now. And then also this HSL colors for HUE or hue or saturation and lightness. The people who like work with Photoshop also are more familiar with these properties and the values. A bit out of the scope of this course actually, but it's nice to know that exists there, and if later you wanted to use it, Of course, you can search online and find more material. And this is also a joke that you can see, like this is black and this is white. So when you get familiar with these color codes, then you see them as like the color name is like being placed there. So later is also interesting thing to be able to read them, or when you use them frequently, you like unconsciously will be familiar with them. All right, now let's get familiar with the properties you need to use for styling text. Font family, font size, font weight, and font style. The family of fonts, as I told before, as I said before, this is the order of the fonts are being used. So if the machine already has the font of the first one, so the content is being loaded with the same font, and if not, then goes to the other font. It is the way that to make sure you have like some sort of a priorities of like fonts being loaded. And then the font size, later we will be familiar with this sizing styles. And then the font weight, if you want to make it bold or normal, or the style of the font, which is like italic or normal or underline. Here you can see example. So the body content would be Arial, 12 pt, bold, and italic. This is like the default text inside of the body tag. And also we have text transfer, text decoration, letter spacing, and word spacing. You can also get familiar with them, like the space between letters, words, and the decoration of the underline and this kind of stuff. And sometimes you want to like show a headline or something in an uppercase way, so you can also transfer them like this to uppercase. Well, this is not nice to show all the contents in the body with uppercase, but it's just for an example. In most of the cases, you really don't define them unless you really need to. And for a styling text also, you use text align, vertical align, and text shadows. So if the align is like on the right, left, or the center, or justify, or vertical align, which is like top, bottom, the center, and then the text shadows. Sometimes you want to apply some shadows for your text, so that's the way actually you also use it. And here are some examples of fonts. I guess all of them already has to be present in your machine or computer. And of course, you can also add some other fonts, and then later we will be familiar with this typeface concept as well, and be able to actually insert a font other than this default fonts that are like already exist in your computer, whether it's a PC, Windows, or Macintosh. Now let's get familiar with the units. We have different units. So we have EM and we have pixel. And then next page also some other styles. So by using EM unit, it's some sort of a scalable unit. So when the default font is 12 pt for your page, then 1 is equal to 12, and then you can also get some portion of that size by using like maybe 2 EM, it become equal to 24, and then you can also use less than 1 in order to obtain the other size. So it's very also nice for mobile devices. And then we have pixel, which is like kind of obvious. We are using like some pixel sizes according to the screen of your the screen resolution. And then we have points, and then percentage. So you can define a percentage to like a certain size and then use the other percentages in order to make it bigger or smaller. And here you can see actually a table of this whole points and pixels, which you can define and use. But make sure to always, when you're like creating your web pages, also view them in different browsers, different devices, on your mobile phone, on your desktop, tablet, to make sure the sizing of the fonts are exactly as you planned and expected. And as I told you before, you can also use some fonts that are not like exist in your machine, or you're not sure if the user also has those fonts or not. So it's a now very interesting feature that you can use, font faces, that you can also include your font in your files, and then make sure the browser is like loading those files, and then your text is being shown in exact font that you're looking forward to. It's a very nice improvement, and you can also search online to find more material, but it's like something like this, that you're like defining the font face, you're assigning a name to it, and then you have a source where this font exists, and then later you can use that name exactly like the previous other font names as well. But it's always recommended to make sure also include other fonts in font family, just to make sure that if for any reason this file is not being loaded, then you also have other options. And you need to also convert and somehow convert this file to this EOT or the other accepted formats. So there are like online tools that you can actually upload your font and then receive this EOT format or the other accepted formats. You can easily search online and actually find it. Now let's discuss the styling links. So there are different properties. Link, which is link color, visited is like the color that you show to the user that you already been to that link. So you can also define a color for that, and then hover for having a mouse over on it, and then active, which is like right clicking on a font, or like holding in like maybe tablets or other like devices. So it's a very nice actually thing to add these color codes to somehow communicate these different parts with your user as well. And here is an example. So you have your A tag, and then like this you are defining those properties. And then we have the concept of boxes, as we discussed in the beginning of the slides. So you can control the dimensions, the borders, margins, and whether you want to show or hide the boxes. So here in this example, you see you have two boxes. You have your div element, and then you have your P element as a paragraph element. So you can see how these boxes are being defined. Now you're like setting the width and height of the box by this. Like first you have the div box here. You can see it's like 200 pixel, and then the width also 200 pixel. And then the P tag, which is inside of this div tag, then you're assigning some percentages of 200 pixels. So 80% means like 160 pixel. And then also the color of those boxes. And then you have mean width, mean height, max height, and overflow, which are also very interesting to use. So mean width guarantee those boxes are not getting smaller than this amount, or max also make sure they're not getting bigger than that amount if you're like assigning some portion of like whole web page or something. And then we have border, margin, padding, which is also interesting to learn. We already discussed them, but you can also find out more, and also tons of material online. Different styles and properties of border. They are self-explanatory, but you can also find out more by yourself. For padding as well, you can assign on the top, right, left, or center. Sorry, not center, but padding is like the whole thing. But same as the other ones, there are like different angles of padding or border you can also define. In some scenarios, you only want to have a padding on the right or left. So CSS also gives this ability to you as well. And same about the margin. And then we have an interesting concept about aligning your content also. In some cases, you want to have them on the left side, right side, or the center, or justified. So by text align, you can easily also do whatever you want to the align of the text, where you want in your box to be like placed. This is also something interesting if you want to somehow play with it and be more familiar with it. And also we have display, visibility, box shadow, and border radius for you to also try and get to know more about. Visibility is like somehow totally understandable. Sometimes you want to hide some elements. And then we also have a styling list, is also an interesting concept. I recommend you to also search online and find out more about like these list properties. And same about tables, also many different related to tables properties. All right, now you see an example of forms in different browsers. Because as we discussed earlier, browsers also have some sort of a default styling rules. So they apply to your form elements if you haven't defined any rules for them. So then you see in different browsers, the look and like style are totally, in some cases, different. About the buttons, about the text box, you see here is like more a square shape, but then here is like more round in Firefox and Safari. So always make sure to open your pages in different browsers to see if the look is like desirable due to your own estimations. Then we have position properties, is also a very important and interesting topic, because sometimes you want to position your elements according to the other elements or based on the size of your page. So it's also very interesting to do. So we have the position aesthetic. So by default, you don't even need to mention this position, because by default, the browser consider the elements as an aesthetic position. So according to their flow of like place of the page and then the HTML code, they are being positioned right after each other. But then with other values, you can also somehow change this order and then place one in front of the other or upside down or something. Then we have the position relative. So imagine you're using a static, and then by replacing them to relative, then you can like somehow set the property top, right, bottom, or left to some value, and then according to its static position, then this relative position a little bit adjust the position of that element according to the value you define for top, right, bottom, or left. And then you have the position fix. So when you position an element as a fixed position, then doesn't matter if you browse around the page, then this element always be shown in the exact distance from like top and left, and you can, or the other way around. So then you can put it in a fixed position. It's not recommended for, of course, all of the elements, but sometimes you may need this fixed position. Especially, I'm quite sure you encounter situations that there is this go to the top link on like the bottom right side of the pages, and when you press them, you go to the top of the page. So usually they use this fixed position for these kind of purposes. And then we have the position absolute, which is also very practical. So when you're using absolute, you're actually positioning the element according to and relative to the nearest positioned ancestor. So it's some sort of another way of positioning an element. But it would be nice if you try them by yourself and then work with these elements to see how they look like, about the sizing and everything. And the other very interesting concept is z-index. So then by defining z-index, you also define which one be in front of the other one and which one be like on the back of the other one. So the greater the number is, the priority of that element to be shown in front is more. So if you're like having a same position for two elements, the one with a greater z-index become and being placed on the front of the other element. And then we have float and clear, which is also interesting if you want to search online and try with the online examples as well to get more familiar with it. And for layout, we also have fixed layout and liquid layout. And the only difference with this layout is like in fixed layout, if you're changing the size of your page, the layout is not being changed according to these like modifications, and measurements are like fixed and in pixel. And then the liquid is according to resizing the page, also they are like being replaced and modified. It's a nice actually feature, and I recommend in most of the cases you use liquid layout. And of course you can also search online and find out more material about them. And then now let's get familiar with how to place background images. So in some cases you not only use the colors but also a certain image for the background, so you can easily set the value of that image, the location of that file like this. Remember, you have to also mention this URL and then put the value like this here. And of course you can also apply this CSS rule for div, paragraph, or the other elements who make sense. For instance, for link doesn't make sense, you have the background image, but for paragraph, div, the span, and body, these are the most common elements, HTML elements, that you can also define a background image, especially body. And here there are these HTML5 layout elements where you can also mention and apply some CSS rules to them. And as I mentioned before, always before uploading your pages to the production server or then make it accessible for your users, try to view them in different browsers. They're actually interesting sites that you can also open and enter your URL link and then see in many browsers with different versions how they look like. So it's also interesting. You don't need to actually install them on your own computer and machine, but it's nice and recommended to at least have the most updated editions of the browsers, especially with Chrome, IE, which is now Edge, Firefox. So they're nice and most used browsers. All right, here are also some further links to get to know more about as a further study those topics. And make sure to report us if there was any mistakes or if there were some topics which you'd like to find out more, or if you have some ideas, and give your feedback to us and be in control of like modifying the contents, because time to time we also update the material and then we always have access with the new ones as well. So thank you for your consideration. That was the end of the part 1, which was introduction to CSS. The next part would be introduction to Bootstrap, and we're gonna have a hands-on experience finally with Bootstrap. So hope to see you on the next part and have a nice day.